Okay, in this section we're talking about disenfranchising African Americans. The essential question we'll start with is what struggles existed for African Americans living in the post-Reconstruction South. So in the 1890s, most African Americans in the rural South lived in conditions that were very, very similar to slavery. African Americans had very little political power and worked under very difficult conditions. And I think we've talked about that enough. The African Americans took a step back after Reconstruction. Most African Americans and an awful lot of poor whites were sharecroppers. And again, to define sharecroppers, a sharecropper is a landless farmer who winds up giving a large portion of their crops to cover the cost of rent and all the other costs of living. And they give these to the landowners. Now, there were some African Americans that wound up leaving the farm and heading for small towns for different jobs. Some even headed west for homesteads. Second essential question, how did Southern lawmakers legalize segregation? Now, I guess the first thing we need to understand that both in the North and the South, African Americans were discriminated against. The difference is in the South, segregation or separation of the races was enforced by laws known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were both state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern states. These laws were enacted after Reconstruction, and these laws continued all the way up until the mid-60s, 1960s. Now, one of the probably most important Supreme Court cases is Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in the Plessy versus Ferguson to endorse the legal doctrine of separate but equal. They talked about facilities for African Americans. We could separate them as long as the facilities were equal. And this winds up establishing a legal basis for discrimination for the next 50 years. Separate but equal. How did Southerners try to intimidate African Americans? Most of the South was dominated politically by the conservative Democrats. Lynching was a part of the informal system of enforcing white supremacy in the late 19th century following Reconstruction. Lynching is the illegal execution of an accused person by a mob. Lynching was originally a system of punishment used by whites against African American slaves. In the late 1800s, mob violence increased in the South. Between 1890 and 1899, hundreds of lynchings took place. About 70% of those victims who were lynched were African Americans. So there were some others that were lynched. And again, we talked about some of the other folks, some of the other groups, the carpetbaggers and the scallywags, those that opposed the general ideas of the South. Lynching of Sam Hose, you'll get a chance to read an article about this very, very ugly part of our history. How did Southern lawmakers begin to disenfranchise or take away a legal right from African Americans? And again, we're talking about the right to vote. The disenfranchisement of African Americans after the Reconstruction era, was based on a series of new laws. New constitution and practices deliberately were used to prevent black citizens from registering to vote and from voting itself. Former Confederate states enacted these measures at the turn of the 20th century in the United States. The state's action defied the 15th Amendment, and we've talked about the 15th Amendment being the voting amendment, right to vote. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1870. which was intended to protect voting rights of freedmen after the Civil War. Southern states used loopholes or legal ways around the law in the 15th Amendment and began to impose restrictions that barred almost all African Americans from voting. Following continuing violence around elections as insurgents worked to suppress black voting, the Democratic-dominated Southern states passed legislation to create barriers to voter registration by blacks and poor whites, starting in 1877 with the Georgia poll tax. Okay, so a poll tax in Mississippi, for instance, in 1890, required all citizens registering to vote to pay a poll tax, which most African Americans and even a lot of poor whites couldn't afford to vote. In 1890, Mississippi adopted a new constitution which contained provisions for voters' registration that required voters to pay the poll tax and pass a literacy test. The literacy test was subjectively applied to white administrators, so they're in charge, and provisions effectively disenfranchised most African Americans and many poor whites. So again, between the literacy test and the poll tax, the white lawmakers, the Southern lawmakers, decided that, to get around the 15th Amendment, they would come up with a poll tax, which they knew most African Americans could not afford to pay, and a literacy test because they understood that most African Americans and many poor whites were unable to read or write. The literacy test is a test given to determine whether a prospective voter was literate, could read or write. Most African Americans had no education. The number of African Americans and poor whites registered to vote drops dramatically. Okay, so these numbers here just kind of give us an example. In 1890, these are those that are registered to vote. In Louisiana in 1890, there's 130,000 Americans that were registered voters. By 1900, that number drops significantly to 5,300. In Alabama, similar numbers. 1890 is 181,000 that are registered to vote, and by 1900, it's 3,700. So you see the smaller numbers, the 5,300 and the 37. Those are the folks that are in power, the very wealthy, the rich, the white. To allow poor whites to vote, some Southern states introduced what were known as grandfather clauses. This clause allowed any man to vote if he had an ancestor on the voting rolls in 1867. Well, most African Americans did not have a relative that were voting prior to 1867 or at 1867. They had just gotten done with being enslaved, so they were not voting. So this allowed the poor whites to kind of now have the right to vote. Now we're going to talk about 3 African American leaders who stood up and responded to discrimination. First one is Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells is a Republican African American from Tennessee who wrote newspaper articles denouncing lynching and mob violence against African Americans. So she really put herself out there, and any newspaper that would take it or magazine, she talked about denouncing. And the one thing that this did do was alert the rest of the country what was happening in the South. Booker T. Washington. Booker T., another African American, he concentrated on economic goals rather than legal or political. And the last one would be W.E.B. Du Bois, and he talked a little bit about demanding the right and the right to vote especially. So the 3 African American leaders put themselves out there and again talked about the need for different ideas. Okay, so hopefully this helps you. And again, if you need to see this again, look at it as many times as necessary. Okay, great. Good job. Thank you.